Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Jessica Main, and I'm a faculty member at the University of British Columbia in the Department of Asian Studies. I teach courses on Buddhism, and I specialize in modern Japanese Buddhism and social ethics. I have the privilege to direct the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society, and it is this program that is sponsoring tonight's lecture. I would like to begin with two acknowledgements. First, I'd like to acknowledge that the place where I live and work and where the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation program is housed is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people, who are currently engaged in struggles over sovereignty for this land. The land at Point Grey campus has been, for the Musqueam people, a place of learning. And I hope that from wherever we are gathered from virtually tonight, that we can gather together in that same spirit to learn from one another. Second, I acknowledge that we gather here today after increasing racist violence, anti-Asian racism, and the awful anti-Asian killings in the United States last week. We must stand together in solidarity and against racism. Tonight, through the generous support of the Robert H. and Ho Family Foundation, we are delighted to host Dr. Scott Mitchell. Scott Mitchell is the Yoshitaka Tamai Professorial Chair in Shin Buddhist Studies at the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, where he also serves as the Dean of Students and Faculty Affairs. He researches, teaches, and writes about Buddhism in the West, Buddhist modernism, and Pure Land Buddhism. I've had the pleasure of hearing lectures from him in the past and reading his works, and I always come away having learned something new. I've heard Scott joke that he wrote the book on Buddhism in America, and he did. In 2016 from Bloomsbury, Buddhism in America, Global Religion, Local Contexts was published, and it is the most up-to-date take on the topic. He notably moves past some of the problematic approaches to Buddhism in America that structured the field in the past, notably with regard to race. Tonight, he is giving us a peek into his next project with a lecture entitled Mid-Century Modern, Jōdo Shinshū and the Making of American Buddhism. So I'd like to remind everyone that this is a webinar format, that you can ask questions using the Q&A function, and that I will kind of gather up those questions and deliver them to the speaker during the Q&A. He will speak first, and then I will throw some questions at him following this. So if I can, I'd like to invite Dr. Scott Mitchell to take charge and talk to us about mid-century modern.
Thank you so much, Dr. Main, for a very kind introduction. I'm going to try to do the sharing of the screen. And while I'm doing that, I'd like to make a couple of acknowledgements myself. I'm at my home here in the San Francisco Bay Area, specifically in a city called Albany, which is the unceded territory of the Ohlone people, who are currently struggling for their own recognition for their own homeland. I also want to acknowledge that yesterday I had my second COVID vaccine, and I am experiencing some side effects from that. So I apologize in advance if I'm a little tired or not as quick on the draw as I would like to be. So to dive into my topic tonight, what I want to do tonight is sort of think through history. I want to recall the history of often forgotten and marginalized persons. This is one of the motivating impulses in my talk tonight. And what I'll be presenting, as Jessica mentioned a second ago, is a sort of condensed version of my current book project. This book will look at the intersection of race and religion, specifically Jōdo Shinshū, or Shin Buddhism, in the making of American Buddhism. And I'd like to open with an excerpt from the Berkeley Busay and a piece titled A House for Our Hopes, written by the Reverend Kanmo Imamura in 1952. The urgent need for a Buddhist center in Berkeley need not be repeated at this time. The past and present records clearly show the contributions made by the Berkeley YBA to the leadership training program, which is the key to the future of the Buddhist movement in America. The meager setting in which they jostle with their many activities belie the faith and acknowledgement felt for a group which might otherwise have unlimited potentialities. Because of the grave nature of the topic, the general meeting held recently by the Berkeley Buddhist Church to discuss the Buddhist Center building project was attended by an unprecedented large and serious crowd. After much discussion, some conclusions were noted after midnight. The great D. Suzuki, seeing the trend and need for Eastern thought among the people of the West, spoke with earnestness to the effect that it is on the shoulders of the Nisei and Sansei, the inheritors of both the Eastern and Western cultures, to bring the true Buddhism to the West and help enrich the American way of life. Now, the Berkeley Busay was a magazine published by the Berkeley Temple's Young Buddhist Association, or YBA, beginning in 1939 through 1942, and then picked up again after the camps from 1950 to 1960. The Berkeley Temple was founded in 1911 by Japanese immigrants. In the late 1800s, as more and more Japanese immigrants immigrated to Hawaii and the US mainland, and because of the majority of them happened to be Jōdo Shinshū Buddhists, priests or missionaries were sent from Japan to help establish local Buddhist groups and eventually temples. As Laurie Pierce, Tomoe Moria, Michihiro Amma, Thomas Tweed, and others have noted, the first part of the 20th century saw a large increase in the number of English language periodicals about Buddhism, including the Busay. The Buddhist Center, Reverend Imamura refers to here, the thing that has caused the general meeting to be attended by a large and crowd, was part of a larger generational shift within the Shin community. The Issei, or first generation Japanese immigrants, had established the religion in America. Their children, the Nisei, were now coming of age, born and raised in America. They were American citizens and were eager to take on larger leadership roles in the community. This included the establishment of educational and training programs for folks who wanted to become priests or ministers. So what I want to do is sort of try to imagine the scene. It's 1951. There's a Buddhist temple on what at the time was a quiet side street less than a mile from the University of California, Berkeley campus. The temple was actually a large wood shingled house. The lower floor was being used as the main hall, or hondo, for services as well as the general meeting like this one. Upstairs, Reverend Imamura lived in a cramped apartment with his wife Jane and their 4 children. For the general meeting, everyone turned out. There were about 100 members of the community at this time, and you can imagine the hondo overflowing with people. I imagine it was hot. I imagine men wearing suits holding their hats in their laps. I imagine cigarette smoke as well as incense swirling in the air before the image of Amida Buddha. Why are they discussing this Buddhist Center building project? What are the many projects and unlimited potential of this young Buddhist association? It helps to know that there was a housing crisis at this time, a housing crisis in Berkeley. Imagine that. The crisis, however, really only affected Black and Asian residents, owing to the fact that Berkeley at the time led the nation with racist and restrictive housing laws, redlining, and so on. Meanwhile, Nisei Japanese Americans were beginning to enroll at UC Berkeley and other area colleges, and they were unable to. And so the Berkeley Temple purchased the building next door to that wood shingled house. It's the building on the left of your screen there. And they opened a student dormitory. Now, in addition to the families, the mothers and fathers and children, they were also college students congregating at the temple. And college students started doing what college students do. They organized. Specifically, they organized the Young Buddhist Association and began the decades-long process of championing simultaneously their rights as American citizens and their religion, Jōdo Shinshū Buddhism.
Scott, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We've had a couple of notes from the Q&A or through the Q&A. One is a request for you to slow down slightly. And just a note that one audience member was having troubles hearing, but it seems like when the paper touches your laptop or whatever device you're using, there is some sort of feedback. So just to make you aware of that, and I do apologize for interrupting.
No problem. I was afraid it was my cat who was bothering people. I will do my best to slow down. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is this topic of the Nisei Shin Buddhists and the making of American Buddhism. This rough sketch of the context that I've given for the community meeting in 1951 hints at a much larger history, the history of both Japanese American Buddhists and American Buddhism more broadly. The first thing I want to do is foreground Jōdo Shinshū in this history and draw out its connections to a larger modernist discourse. You'll recall that Reverend Imamura mentions the great D. Suzuki in his piece, and yes, that's D.T. Suzuki. What's the famous Zen apologist doing at a Shin temple in 1951? This points to the second thing I want to discuss tonight: connections or lineages, infrastructure, and the often invisible labor that makes Buddhism possible. So first things first, I want to reiterate that my presentation tonight is a short version of a book that I'm writing. So there are a lot of things that I'm just not going to be able to get into, and I'll merely hint at. And hopefully we can discuss more in the Q&A. But what I want to start with is this radical idea that Japanese American Shin Buddhists were in fact Shin Buddhists. I'm going to say that again. Shin Buddhists are Shin Buddhists. I recognize that this sounds strange, but I think it's important to note the curious way that Shin Buddhism is elided in our standard histories of American Buddhism. These historical narratives usually begin with 19th century immigrants, such as the Japanese Shin Buddhists I'm talking about tonight, but their histories are often told through the lens of acculturation or Americanization, and it glosses over the specifics of their faith. Much more scholarship has been done on how Buddhism became popular in the 1950s and into the 1960s and 70s. Evidence for this popularity usually comes in the form of more and more people converting to Zen Buddhism or taking up meditation, mainstream media support for Tibet and the Dalai Lama, and the more recent mindfulness meditation movement. In short, white people. White people are evidence that Buddhism is popular in America. White People Making Buddhism Popular and the Eliding of Asian American Buddhism is the title for a completely different talk. And I would encourage everybody to go out and buy Tenzing Han's recent book, Be the Refuge, and invite her to give talks at your community. Listen to what she has to say. What I want to draw our attention to here, however, is the lack of any Shinshū in this popularity. Despite the fact that Shin Buddhists have been in this country for over 125 years, and despite the fact that very often they refer to themselves as American Buddhists, Shin Buddhism is curiously absent all the same. I want to think through this absence, problematize it, and ask some questions about what this might mean. In short, I want to foreground Shin Buddhism, and to start, I want to call our attention to the curious way that scholars have persistently suggested that Shin Buddhists in the US aren't really all that interested in Shin Buddhism. For example, Michihiro Amma, in his excellent Immigrants to the Pure Land from 2011, notes that early North American Shin Buddhists were much more interested in promoting a non-sectarian or general Buddhism, especially to white people who were more likely more interested in Theravada Buddhism. In her study of the early 20th century Shin Buddhist publication, Light of Asia, Laurie Pierce makes a similar argument. She notes that nowhere in the Light of Asia do authors discuss Shinran, the founder of the Shin sect, or Shin Buddhist doctrine, but they do talk a lot about this general Buddhism. Pierce argues, and she's absolutely right about this, that by the early 20th century, we're on the receiving end of a century of Orientalist scholarship that has been obsessed with original Buddhism, the Buddhism of the historical Buddha, a Buddhism that was to be found in Pali and Sanskrit texts of ancient India and not in modern Asia. At the same time, we're also on the receiving end of several centuries of Christian polemics against Japanese Buddhism. 16th century Jesuit missionaries in Japan wrote about Shin Buddhism and found it too Protestant. Later, Protestant missionaries found it too Catholic. So the argument goes, when writing for white folks, better to stick with the basics. Let's not confuse people with Shinjin or Tariki or Jinen Honi. Let's go back to the Four Noble Truths. Ryan Anningson's otherwise excellent dissertation picks up this thread as well, and here we get to the subject of my talk tonight, the Berkeley Busay. Anningson writes that, quote, younger generations of Shin adherents born in the United States began to call for reform in light of common societal tropes. Throughout the Berkeley Busay, article after article is written on Gautama Buddha, Great Reformer, Nikaya study guides, and instructions for meditation, none of which are traditionally a part of Shin Buddhist practice. In fact, the religion section of the Busay throughout the entirety of 1950 contains no articles mentioning Amida, but 5 on Shakyamuni specifically, including 1 article about nirvana with no mention of Shinjin. Now, whereas Anningson is correct that there are several articles about Shakyamuni in the Busay, having created an index of every article published between 1939 and 1960, I can tell you that by and large, these articles are not written by the younger generations, the Nisei Japanese American Buddhists. They are most often written by white contributors or international Asian scholars. Moreover, Anningson is simply incorrect to say that there are no articles about Amida in the 1950s. Here in the 1950 volume is an article by Shunya Pratt, who I'll say more about in a minute, titled Buddhism in Daily Life, wherein she mentions by name Amida Buddha when she writes, "When we rise in the morning, let our first thought be that of gratitude and veneration toward Amida. Let it strike the keynote of the day until at the close of evening, our last thoughts are directed toward the eternal Buddha." We can also find articles such as this one by Kimi Hitsune called Shinshū in a Changing World, or her essay, The Problem of Faith, which basically argues that not only is Shin Buddhism modern, but it'll also make you a better person. We have H.T. Terakawa writing in 1939 on the sayings of Renyo Shonin, basically telling us about all these cool things that Renyo did. We should be like him, we should have an altar, say the name, and so on. We have Manabu Fukuda reminding us in 1942 Gasho, which is to say the name, Namo Veda Butsu, before every meeting and every activity of the Young Buddhist Association. And of course, we have the eminent Taitetsu Uno, who makes dozens of appearances in the Busay, writing here about a life of naturalness, aka Jiden Honi. This is basically a long description of Myokonin, the sort of holy fools of Shin religious literature. And here he is again in 1957, writing about the essence of Shin. And this is actually a translation of a 13th century Shin commentary, the Anjin Ketsujosho. And it's not just the younger generations, the Nisei of Japanese Americans who get into the Shinshū action. Here's Gene Wood in 1940 talking about Buddhism in modern life. This is your standard modernist explication of Buddhism. But toward the end, he implores, surrender yourself to the eternal arms of Amida and your suffering will be dissolved in limitless joy. There's another great article by Robert Jackson, who at the time was a student at Cal and later would go on to his own academic career in Buddhist studies. He starts this 1954 essay off by claiming that the Buddha gave the teaching of Mappo, or the decline of the Dharma, not as a literal teaching, but as a challenge to get us to diligently work toward awakening. This is pretty standard modernist self-power stuff, but then he says, Amida's compassion causes him to remain among sentient creatures outside nirvana until all are saved. Are we insensitive to this sacrifice? Can we not hasten the enlightenment of humanity in respect and gratitude for Amida's selfless vow? And to go back to Shunya Pratt, Shunya Pratt was a white woman who converted to Shin and was ordained as a Shin priest in 1936, of whom Michihiro Amma says, quote, was not initially interested in Shin Buddhism. Here she is in the 1939 Busay writing, Lord Buddha in his teaching taught us that the path of the Buddhas which he trod is the path also for us to tread, that even as he found the eternal Buddhahood within himself, so his teaching is to show us the way to the same thing, to awaken our sleeping inner self to the realization of the power of Amida Buddha. This to me reads as fairly standard Shinshū teaching that Shakyamuni appeared in this world to teach the Dharma of Amida Buddha's path to the Pure Land. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the Busay is pretty Shin. It's pretty Jōdo Shinshū. Now, I want to be clear here that I'm not saying that there weren't efforts to promote a more generalized, universal, or non-sectarian Buddhism, both within the North American Shin community and also to converts or outsiders. I'm generally in agreement with Pierce and Moria and others who note that, especially in the early 20th century, as Japan was asserting itself on the global stage, Japanese Buddhist intellectuals were beginning to assert themselves as well, making attempts to define Buddhism on their own terms. And this meant engaging with and often replicating a generalized or original Buddhism discourse. So yes, there's an impulse to present a general or non-sectarian Buddhism, especially to white converts and sympathizers, but there's also a hell of a lot of Shinshū in this material. How do we reconcile these two thoughts? And the other thing I just want to point out is that I'm aware of the fact that some of the writing, especially Shunya Pratt's writing here, is very much of a time. It's very much of the pre-war period. And some of this stuff is not what we would consider to be normative or sort of orthodox Jōdo Shinshū teachings. I'm not making the argument that folks are being sort of normatively Shinshū, but I am curious about the way that they express Shinshū on their own terms. And here I'm sort of thinking of Talal Asad and his notion of not judging whether or not people are Muslim, but asking how. So that's the question I'm asking. How are these people Jōdo Shinshū, not whether or not they're Jōdo Shinshū. So to help clarify my point here, I want to call our attention to two different pieces by two different Imamuras, Emyo and his son Kanmo. First up, we have Emyo Imamura's 19 essay, Democracy According to the Buddhist Viewpoint. This piece has received a lot of scholarly attention. It's an excellent piece of history wherein Imamura does the heavy lifting of defending Buddhism against the folks who think it has no place in America and links Buddhism directly to American ideals of democracy and egalitarianism. However, I'm of the opinion that this essay is mistitled, that it should be Democracy According to the Jōdo Shinshū viewpoint. He starts his essay off with some general ideas about Buddhism, several references to Buddhism being basically monistic and thus akin to an egalitarian spirit. But then a few pages in, he gets to this. Let us, however, proceed a little further into details and expound some of the main teachings of the Jōdo Shinshū. This has the largest number of influential followers and is the most representative Buddhist sect in the East. The Shinshū sect is really the rational culmination of the Buddhist teachings as they have gradually unfolded themselves in history. If Buddhism were to thrive among us as a living faith, it could not but be the Shinshū in which all the philosophy and religion of Buddhism finds its permanent solution. The rest of this essay is about Shin Buddhism, and the very last words are Amitabha Buddha. What I want to call our attention to here is how Shinshū was framed not only as the largest and most influential school of Buddhism in the East, not just in Japan, but as the rational culmination of Buddhism. The second piece I want to call our attention to brings us back to the Busay, and this is the essay Oneness by Kanmo Imamura, Emyo's son. This is an essay that's referred to by Amma and Anningson and others as evidence of a rift in the community between those who are arguing for a universal Buddhism and those arguing for a more sectarian Shin Buddhism. In fact, Anningson says of this essay that in it, quote, Imamura describes the disagreements within the Busay groups over whether Amida or Shakyamuni should be the basis of faith, and writes that a battle broke over some young people replacing Amida with Shakyamuni on the church altar. Here's the paragraph in this essay that Anningson is referring to. Imamura writes, I have heard of occasions where young people considered replacing the picture of Amida with that of Shakyamuni. Only Shin Buddhism, one cries, original Buddhism, the other cries, until it is heard almost like a battle cry. Okay, so could this be a recounting of an actual battle, of an actual fight between two different people or even factions within the community, and specifically about changing the image on the main altar of the temple? Maybe, but in the absence of any corroborating evidence, we don't know that. On its own, this is just a rumor. What's more, we need to be attentive to the context of this quote within this polemic. Yes, oneness is a polemic. Imamura starts out by saying that if somebody asked you to choose whether your true parent was your mother or your father, you would laugh at them and call them stupid. The same is true for trying to choose between Shakyamuni and Amida. Such debates, he says, have no place in the community, and then he concludes with, it is important that we understand what the symbol stands for, whether Amida or Shakyamuni, for are they not our father and mother and ultimately the same and one? I'd argue that this essay is not recounting a specific event, but is instead a reaction to a current point of contestation within the community about the emphasis of practice. And the conclusion Imamura reaches is not to choose sides, but to claim that the whole debate is a pointless waste of time. Moreover, he ends with a statement about the inherent non-duality of Shakyamuni and Amida. Whereas some folks have argued that Shin Buddhism of this era was trying to highlight a more original teaching of the Buddha, I have a hard time reading this non-duality between two cosmic Buddhas as anything but normative Mahayana cosmology. To go back to Emyo Imamura's claim that Shin is the rational culmination of Buddhism, to me, this evokes what Robert Sharf has written about D.T. Suzuki and his, to quote Sharf, convoluted logic, that it is only in Japan that Zen comes to full flower in Japanese spirituality. Again, to quote Sharf, Suzuki claims that while Buddhism was brought to Japan from the continent, it was only in Japan that Buddhism would find its ultimate expression, end quote. Of course, as Sharf shows in this essay, Suzuki is a modernist, and he's doing the work of other contemporaneous modernists in bringing together Buddhist and European strands of thought to create what David McMahon has called the hybrid tradition of Buddhist modernism. What I want to call our attention to here is that while we are quick to recognize that Zen apologists of this era are modernizing the tradition, for some reason, at the same time, we are suggesting that American Shin Buddhists aren't doing the same thing. Instead, they're trying to be non-sectarian while promoting a more general or universal Buddhism. If that's the case, What do we do with Imamura's claim that Shinshū is the culmination of Buddhist philosophy and religion? What do we do with all the Shinshū stuff in the Busay? So bringing up McMahon obviously brings us up to Buddhist modernism, and I want to take a brief tour into this topic. I have a whole chapter on this in my book, so bear with me for a second. I don't think I need to summarize the entirety of the Buddhist modernism literature. There's simply too much of it. Moreover, I'm increasingly in agreement with folks like Natalie Cooley and Pema McLaughlin in that modernity as a frame is deeply problematic. Leaving all of that aside, I want to simply state that in their research on Buddhist modernism, scholars have created a lineage that highlights a shared discourse, a way of talking about Buddhism as rational, scientific, peaceful, civilizing, better than Christianity. And it's a lineage that leaves off Shin and Asian American Buddhists. Evidence of this lineage project can be seen clearly in works such as Donald Lopez's A Modern Buddhist Bible. Whereas McMahon states that Buddhist modernism, quote, has been a co-creation of Asian, European, and Americans, and in his book, he details many of the individuals implicated in this co-creation. He does not list them per se. Lopez, on the other hand, does. His collection of primary sources on Buddhist modernism, in his words, presents selections from the works of 31 figures who have figured in the formation of modern Buddhism. None of these 31 figures is Asian American. None talk about Jōdo Shinshū Buddhism. Moreover, Lopez writes, quote, what is remarkable about the lives of these figures is the degree of their interconnection. There is not a single author here who was not acquainted with at least one other, thus creating a lineage so essential to modern Buddhism. Indeed, lineage is essential. Without connections between individuals, ideas stop flowing. If D.T. Suzuki had just stayed home and not come to Chicago in 1893, he'd never have met Paul Karras, or his wife for that matter, and perhaps he would never have returned to the US after the war and published so widely on Zen Buddhism, attracting the likes of Alan Watts and Jack Kerouac, who would further write and publish about Buddhism, thus making Buddhism popular in the back half of the 20th century. But remember, here's the great D. Suzuki at the Berkeley Temple back in 1951. The point here is not to chide Professor Lopez for his lack of inclusion of Asian American Buddhists in a book that's now nearly 20 years old. Perhaps if he's revising it, he can add Uno or Imamura to the lineage. The point is to simply note that if we're going to go into the lineage construction business, and that if that lineage is going to be defined both by discourse and personal connection, that is, the moderns are all basically saying the same thing, and the moderns have some personal connection to each other, then North American Shin Buddhists pass on both accounts. Now, D.T. Suzuki does not, he was an audience member in 1951, but he doesn't contribute to the Berkeley Busay. However, Alan Watts does, starting in 1952 and again in 1953, and 55, and 56, and 57, and also 1960. Also included in Lopez's lineage are Gary Snyder and Jack Kerouac. Snyder contributed poetry to every issue of the Busay from 1954 through 1960. In 1956, Kerouac published the 223rd chorus of his Mexico City Blues in the Busay 3 years before its official publication by Grove Press and a year before the publication of On the Road. And the very last thing ever published in the Busay, the very last and final piece of the 1960 volume, is this, a quintessentially Kerouac prose poem about his meeting and sharing tea with D.T. Suzuki. Now, again, to be clear, all of this might be a good argument for the inclusion of Jōdo Shinshū and Japanese American Buddhists in the lineage of Buddhist modernism, but I am not particularly interested in arguing for that right now. That is, the point of all of this is not to simply argue for inclusion or complain about our historical narratives. Again, there are some significant conceptual and theoretical problems with the very category of modernity. I am actually far more interested in that night in 1951, that meeting in the old temple building. What was the debate about? Why was D.T. Suzuki even there in the first place? And more importantly, who wasn't in the room? As I said at the beginning of this talk, the meeting in 1951 was in part to debate the raising of funds to build a new temple, but not just a new temple, a campus. Even before the internment camps, And especially after, the American Shin Buddhist community was increasingly focused on educating Nisei Shin Buddhists in America to become ministers at local temples. More and more Nisei and soon Sansei or third generation Buddhists were clamoring for priests who and leaders who really understood their experiences as Americans, racially and religiously othered Americans to be sure, but Americans nonetheless. This educational program dovetailed with another long-standing project of Shin Buddhists in the Americas, missionary work, proselytization. In other words, while this project was inspired by and in support of educating American-born Shin Buddhists, it was not limited to education. It was part of a project of spreading the Dharma in America to everyone. There is now a well-circulating image of the first two Nishi Honganji priests in the continental US, the Reverend Sonoda and Nishijima, on the occasion of their arrival in San Francisco in 1899. This is what led to the establishment of the North American Buddhist Mission, which during World War II turned into the Buddhist Churches of America. This image is from the San Francisco Chronicle, and the accompanying article is predictably awful. In a nutshell, it warns that these two priests have come to convert white folks to Buddhism, and you can practically hear people clutching their pearls in fear of these heathens ruining America. Now, how this image is most often used today is part of a larger conversation about religion and racism and anti-Japanese sentiment, which of course led to the concentration camps during World War II. And that's an important story, and you should all go out and buy Duncan Williams's American Sutra. The point I want to make here, though, is let's be honest. Yes, there was a hell of a lot of anti-Japanese and anti-Buddhism racism and discrimination happening at the time, but these two priests were also here to promote the Dharma and convert white people. To quote Laurie Pierce, why wouldn't Buddhist missionaries attempt to make converts in addition to caring for their countrymen and women? The Light of Dharma, which I mentioned earlier, the subject of Pierce's essay, was published from 1901 to 1907. At the same time that Sonoda and Nishijima are helping Japanese immigrants set up Buddhist temples, they are also publishing a magazine for white folks. They are also proselytizing. And yes, oftentimes, this was an odd or idiosyncratic version of a general Buddhism, but there must have been some Shinshū in there as well. Why else would Pratt remind us that gratitude toward Amida should make the keynote of the day? Now, the second part of my book, drawing on these connections, deals with transnationalism and movement, the movement of persons and ideas across the Pacific, especially in the post-war years. Thomas Tweed's done work on this by looking at magazines and publications like The Light of Dharma, and Michael Masatsugu has done work on what he calls the Pan-Pacific Buddhist world. What I want to talk about is buildings. Remember buildings? Places where we could go to have these kinds of meetings rather than in little Zoom boxes. We might not need buildings anymore, but the Berkeley Temple did. And that's why they were having that meeting back in 1951 about the need to raise money to replace the old building with this one, a new temple that would include a study center, a place where people could meet and study the Dharma together, which is exactly what happened. Even before 1951, on November 11th, 1949, the first meeting of the study group was held at the home of Shinobu Matsuda, Jane Imamura's mother. This study group grew over time, developing into the nascent ministerial education program, but also the advanced study group, a group that attracted not only Nisei Buddhists looking to become Buddhist priests, but also white graduate students from Cal and other universities like Robert Jackson and Alex Wayman. And lest we think that this represented some sort of parallel congregation where the Japanese and Shin students were in one group and the white folks were in another group. Nope, they were all together. Kimiko Sutsune, mentioned before, is credited as a member of the advanced study group, going toe-to-toe with Jackson and the others. How did Alan Watts get all mixed up in this? For 3 days in August of 1951, the Berkeley Temple hosted a seminar or a conference on Buddhism with the express aim of making Buddhism more well-known to the general public. Alan Watts was an invited speaker, and he'd be invited back dozens of times over the next decade. These events, this building, made things possible. There's a really interesting story in the Busay, the 1954 issue, about Lama Tada's contribution. Lama Tada was a Japanese monk who had studied in Tibet with the Dalai Lama. Over the course of 1953, twice a week, he would settle in at Mrs. Matsura's house, and together with Kanmo and Jane Imamura, they worked on translations of the Vimalakirti Sutra and the Srimala Devi Sutra from the Busay. Finally, on the evening of October 6, 1953, a week before Lama Tada's departure for Japan, perhaps for the first time in history, the translations were completed on American soil. The foursome, Lama Tada, the Imamuras, and Hitoshi Tsufura, celebrated this occasion over pie a la mode at midnight, elated that somehow they had helped plant a part of the foundation of Buddhism in the new continent. Now, we might have some questions. Why the Vimalakirti and Srimala Devi Sutras? Why not the three Pure Land Sutras, for example? The bigger question really, for me, is what kind of pie? I'm joking, sort of, but I'm also kind of serious. Not so much about knowing what kind of pie, but in bringing our attention back to something I said earlier. Let us be attentive to who is in the room, but also to who is not in the room. Note that this passage names the four people working on the translation, the Imamuras, Hitoshi Tsufura, and Lama Tada, but it doesn't say who served the pie. My guess would be Mrs. Matsura. My guess is that when we return to that overcrowded room in 1951, the great D. Suzuki is in the room, and there were likely dozens of people, mostly women, who were not in the room. Now, the usual thing to do here might be to point out and decry the gender imbalance, but instead I want to suggest that the pie a la mode is every bit as important as the translation itself. I want to suggest that the pie symbolically represents a Buddhist home, a building, a place where other activities become possible. Without the Berkeley Temple, the great D. Suzuki is just some guy wandering around Berkeley and nobody's listening to him. Part of what I hope to do in this book is to draw our attention not only to the role of Shin Buddhism in the making of American Buddhism, that is the role of Shin doctrine or thought or philosophy or what have you, but the role of Shin Buddhists. Both Shinobu Matsura and her daughter Jane Imamura refer to themselves as Bo-mori or temple wives in their memoirs. Jessica Starling's excellent ethnographic study on contemporary Japanese Bo-mori expertly reveals the, quote, female half of clerical partnerships of Jōdo Shinshū temples and complicates the distinctions we might be inclined to draw between lay and cleric, priest and wife, domestic and religious, and so on. Her study is about the contemporary situation in Japan, but I think we can see similar dynamics playing out here in these historical documents, with Jane Imamura playing an important role as both wife and religious leader in her community. Similarly, Matsura was not in the room translating the sutra. Perhaps she was the one serving the pie and the ice cream, but she was also responsible for bringing the Amida image, this Amida image, from Japan in 1956 for installation in the new Berkeley Buddhist temple. This is a story that is told and retold down to this day as a fundamental part of the temple's identity. To put it another way, while Alan Watts is sucking all of the air out of the room, while his idiosyncratic hot takes on Zen continue to sell books, he'd be a nobody if the Imamuras hadn't invited him to tea. So what's all this have to do with American Buddhism? And some, and recognizing that we should get to the Q&A, which I'm very interested in my work, I want to critically reimagine American Buddhist history. And rather than focus on missionaries or charismatic figures or pioneers who we usually give credit for popularizing Buddhism, I want to ask who's serving the pie. I want to do some speculative history and ask some what if questions. What if we imagine history from a different point of view? What if these places, these buildings were never here, and as a result, other things became possible or other things didn't become possible? So at that point, I'll simply say thank you and hopefully have some Q&A.
I think that brings us to the end of our public talk this evening. I just wanted to express my thanks to everyone who had the ability to join us, and thank you very much for excellent questions and discussion. Scott, thank you so much for your time tonight and for giving us a sneak peek into the new book. And I think based on the questions, there's a lot of excitement about when that will come out, and we look forward to it. I would like to thank the Robert H. N. Ho Family Foundation for their sponsorship of the program in Buddhism and Contemporary Society. I'd like to thank the work of the Department of Asian Studies that makes our program at UBC possible. To thank all of you in the audience, my intrepid events coordinator, Michelle, who is hidden behind the icon of the Buddhism and Contemporary Society program. Basically, it was wonderful to host you all, and we look forward to having you at future events. On that note, we have Chen-Xing Han and her book on Become the Refuge, a discussion which is co-sponsored with us and Banyan Books here in Vancouver. Her book launch is coming up, and Scott Mitchell gave you an indication as to why that book could be so important. All right. Thanks again for joining us tonight. I don't have to tell you to stay safe on your way home. As you close your computers, be careful. Good night, everyone.